Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Black Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Carrie Ann Williams, and I'm a psychiatrist practicing right here in Massachusetts. And this is a talk show that's about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community. So if you have any questions or comments throughout the show, you can drop it in the comment section. I'll be able to see it and respond if needed. This is streaming live on Facebook and YouTube. And so this week, I have back on the show with me, Mr. Leon Smith, Esquire. He is the executive director of Citizens for Juvenile Justice, which is a statewide organization that has advocated for systemic reform to achieve equitable youth justice since 1994. In addition to his leadership of CfJJ, Leon has been active on a number of key coalitions and working groups, including the Massachusetts Juvenile Justice Coalition and the statewide Connection on School Policing. And on the last show, so he was on last year, we spoke a little bit about the school to prison pipeline and how the presence of police officers, also known as school resource officers, they have weak evidence to support their continued use. And we kind of spoke about that a little bit last time. And so welcome to the show, Leon.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell us a little bit about what is CfJJ?
Yeah, so CfJJ, Citizens for Juvenile Justice, as you mentioned in the intro, we were founded in 1994 as the only independent nonprofit statewide organization working to reform and reimagine not just the juvenile justice, but other youth serving systems in Massachusetts as well. If you look back at our founding in 1994, it really was founded by Citizens for Juvenile Justice. You had juvenile and youth justice professionals, lawyers, mental health professionals, youth serving providers who were working with and fighting for young people on an individual case-by-case basis, but they acknowledged that there was a need for an entity to handle that same fight at the legislature and on a systemic level. 1994 was when we were in the midst of very harsh rhetoric against young people, super predators and things of that nature. And here in Massachusetts, then Governor Weld was pushing to make juvenile justice much more punitive, to make it much easier to try young people as adults and to move juvenile justice from the Executive Office of Health and Human Services, which is focused on treatment and rehabilitation, over to the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security, which is where our prisons and really our correctional system lies. So out of that sort of looming threat, our founders came together, founded CfJJ to really be that systemic arm for creating reform and not just protecting, but advancing the best interests of young people. And 27 years later, we're still here.
Wow, that's amazing that it's been such a long time and it hasn't fallen apart, like it hasn't stopped. You know, the momentum is still going. There's still things to advocate for. There's still reasons to kind of be present, you know?
Absolutely. And truth be told, I mean, we've come a long way. I'm an attorney, and when I started practicing in the juvenile courts in the early 2000s, our juvenile court, the deep end of our juvenile court system, there were a lot of young people in our system. Our system is really a fraction of the size that it used to be. So we have had positive reform. However, when you look at the system, it's smaller, but as it's gotten smaller, it's gotten darker. It's the disparities impacting young people of color have not only remained, they've actually increased. So the truth is, we've been fighting the good fight for a long time and we've made positive impact, but we still have a lot of work left to do.
And I think sometimes even on the national stage, we see this play out where we have young people, depending on what their race is, they're seen differently by judges and court systems. So a young person who's 18 or 19-year-old, if they're, maybe one particular race, they're more likely to be seen as, it's a young person who made a misstep. Let's give them another chance. And if they're of a different, ethnic background, they may not get that second chance. They're kind of seen as someone who needs to be disciplined. I wanted to know, based on what you've found so far, what's kind of the current state of disparities in youth justice, and what are some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I mean, the short answer to that is that young people of color are disproportionately represented at every single decision point in our youth justice system. So if you start at incarceration, which is obviously, the harshest outcome you can have. Black young people in Massachusetts are 7 times as likely to be incarcerated as their white counterparts. That's the 11th worst rate in the
That's
nation.
a lot.
In Massachusetts, we often talk about where we're in the top 5 or the top 10. Well, when it comes to rates of incarceration for Black youth, we're very close to the bottom 10 there. And for Hispanic young people, they're 5.7 times as likely to be incarcerated. And that's actually the worst rate of disparity in America.
Wow.
So when you look at incarceration and that outcome, our disparities are really high. But I don't want to present as if incarceration is the only decision point where that exists. If you go to, there's a Juvenile Justice Policy and Data Board in Massachusetts, which was created out of the 2018 Criminal Justice Reform Act. And, they release a report to the legislature annually. And when you look at that report and you look at all of the decision points in the juvenile justice system, from arrest to having cases filed in court, to being sentenced to probation, to be committed to the deep end of the system, our young people of color are disproportionately represented at each of those, between 2 and 4 times for Black youth and between 1.5 and 2.5 for Hispanic youth at all those different decision points. So there's a consistency in disparity really peaking at the incarceration point.
Oh, so every single step, and even last time we spoke about school resource officers in schools,
Yeah.
that even it's happening just from the beginning.
Absolutely. And we will talk about this today, but from a very young age, and you mentioned those studies where it's how we perceive young people, the essence of innocence, the seminal study which talked about how our young people of color are perceived as being older than they are, and therefore we're somehow deserving of harsher treatment. That starts at very young ages, and it's just consistent throughout their upbringing.
Now, is there any evidence that youth of color actually have more infractions or commit more crimes? Because I feel like that is one of the perceptions, that there's probably a percentage of the US voters that probably have that perception that, this system is keeping us safe because there is a disparity in who is committing, crimes or violations. And what's the truth?
That is a long standing stereotype driven by the media and other sources, but in reality, it's simply not true. So in 2017, there was a detention utilization study that was commissioned here in Massachusetts, which looked at, okay, that detention point that I talk about, who is going into detention and are there disparities? That studied, it controlled for charge type as well as for age and gender. So it basically says, okay, here are 2 young people, same age, same gender, same charge level, and so that was the lens through which it was done. And that study found that Black youth in Massachusetts are 91% more likely to be detained than white youth, even when you control for charge type. So even when you're looking at a similar type of charge, you see that significantly greater likelihood that Black kids are going to be detained. Outside of that study, you look at national research. There's a book called Reforming Juvenile Justice, and it found that disparities cannot be adequately explained by differential offending, and it points to a few other factors. One being, differential enforcement, how police, enforce our community. So let's take a scenario of a group of young people are sitting on a wall hanging out. Does that officer in the suburbs drive up and just say, okay, move along? Whereas in the city, an officer drives up and those young men are put against the wall and they are patted down or frisked or maybe even arrested for trespassing. That's not the kid's behavior, it's how the adults are interacting. There's also differential processing. Aren't all kids getting equal access to diversion? Are some kids getting a case dismissed with community service and other kids are getting a continuance without a finding, which is supervised by probation? That decision of who gets committed to a secure confinement versus who doesn't. That's really what makes up those disparities, not how the kids are acting.
Wow. And I guess when we think about it, just for, for our listeners who may be wondering, how are kids, coming into contact with the legal system? What are some of the different kind of pathways or touch points where a youth of color may be coming into contact with the justice system?
Well, one, and I know we spoke about this before, but I really have to start there, is that school to prison pipeline. I mean, the fact that and for me, as someone whose parents were public school educators, we stress the importance of education as really that golden key to bettering yourself. But yet our children from pre-kindergarten through 12th grade being disproportionately targeted for discipline and punishment, be that school suspension, where we've learned that through studies from out of the University of Chicago, where when young people are out of school due suspension or expulsion, their likelihood of interacting with the juvenile justice system doubles, as well as having police in our schools and having kids arrested and pushed directly into the system. That school to prison pipeline is huge, and the disparities there in suspension and arrests, are so high as well. But also you have to look at policing and the way our communities are policed as a significant pathway as well. When you look at the aggressive use of Terry stops or stop and frisk, and the degree to which that increases the likelihood of ending up in the system. The ACLU did a report for Boston, Black residents accounted for 63% of stop and frisk, while only being 25% of the city's population. 200,000 of those stops led to no arrest or charge, and contraband was only found in 2%. So you see how the way police engage with Black and brown communities is different and is harsher, and that greatly increases the likelihood that young people will be pushed into the system.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. And no, a lot of the youth that I work with have some amount of involvement with the Department of Children and Families, some kind of a welfare kind of system where they someone has asked for the state to have some level of involvement. Sometimes it's full guardianship, sometimes it's a partial guardianship of some kind, but there's some involvement. And I wonder, how does that play into, can it help, in terms of diversion, or, how many of these youth that are involved with the justice system are also involved with the welfare system?
Yeah, so it's interesting. At CfJJ, we have a multi-system youth project, which is led by attorney Kate Lowenstein. And she did a report called Dismantling the Trauma to Prison Pipeline, which focused on young people in the child welfare system and how child welfare involvement actually increases the likelihood of young people being involved in juvenile justice, how there is a flow of young people. For years, we've called them crossover youth. They're involved with the DCF system, as you said, due to an allegation of abuse or neglect. So these are clearly young people who have a level of need, but rather than those needs being met, much as in the school situation, we have young people who are coming in the schoolhouse door with needs, but then they're ending up being punished and sent towards the system. We see that in our child welfare system as well. In talking about the child welfare system, we have to talk about racial disparities in what young people enter the child welfare system as well. When we talk about systems of surveillance, we often talk about policing, or we talk about technology as surveillance. But there have been recent studies that have talked about child welfare as a system of surveillance that disproportionately impacts Black and brown parents as well. 71% of Black children in Massachusetts can expect a DCF investigation by the time they turn 18.
71%?
71%. That is 2 times the rate as comparable white children. And it poses a risk 2.6 times higher for Black children to enter into the system. And so, and really, when you look at that again, there's a benefit of a doubt that's given, particularly in white suburban areas where something happens, and our parents of color, particularly in urban areas, are not given that benefit of a doubt. And so young people come into the system at a greater rate. Once they're in, they're less likely in Massachusetts to be placed with kin. It's traumatic being removed from your home, even if your home isn't perfect. But placing with kin and other family can make that transition easier, but that's less likely to happen for young people of color. So when you take that, the removal, less likely to be with family, and the fact that we rank 50th in the nation in placement stability, meaning you don't just come and go to one foster home or one placement. In Massachusetts, you end up bouncing around. Think about what that means for school when you're bouncing around. Think about what that means in general, just for your level of anxiety as a young person. Think about how that can lead to you going completely off track. And that's really kind of the picture of what happens with our child welfare youth.
Wow. And I would say, as a psychiatrist, that sometimes what I see when our kids have moved to so many different places is they keep changing the DCF worker because they're now in a new DCF office. So they're moving from this office to that office. And then they don't have a kind of stable medical services. So they had a primary care provider, and then now they moved over here. So they don't have a primary care provider. And they're on medications, and I don't know who prescribed them because it was like 5 physicians ago that they started the medications. And it's a kind of a nightmare. They have so many cavities because they haven't had stable dental services. It's really a big problem with the placement.
Absolutely. So you have a kid who's in the child welfare system and they're acting out, whatever sense of stability they've had has been disrupted. Maybe they're supposed to be on medication and just due to transitions, they don't have it. And so instead of just being like, wow, that's a bad kid who did this, let's look at everything this young person has went through. And I want to dial in on the educational impact of what happens when you're in a state that's 50th in placement stability and you're bounced placement to placement. Like, as you stated, changing workers and things like that are a reality, but changing schools. We're talking about a population of young people that's 2.5, have a greater likelihood, child welfare versus non-child welfare involved, 2.5 times the rate of chronic absenteeism. They're 10 times as likely to be retained and 6.5 times as likely to drop out of school. Because when you have that period where you're sort of bounced around and you fall behind, it's tough to catch up.
They get discouraged. I'll talk to kids and I'll say, do you like school? And they say, no, I don't like school. And there's all these problems because when they change to a new school, now they have to figure out, okay, what grade level are you at? What were you taught at your last school? What are your gaps in your knowledge? So we have these kids that have average to above average intelligence that are sometimes redoing work they already learned or missing out on work they should be learning because of the changes in schools.
I tell people all the time, think of a scenario in your own life where you had to be the new kid in school and just how anxious you were and how tough that was and having to make new friends. Now imagine doing that 3 times in one school year or 4 times in one school year. It's a lot.
Yeah. And, one thing that I think about with youth justice, because, I would imagine, okay, why is it that courts don't kind of connect? If someone's involved with the welfare system, then they may have greater mental health needs.
Yes.
And why is it, I guess, what's the state of the use of diversion programs? Because I feel like there's some areas, right, where I hear stories about robust diversion programs and, some districts where they're like, yes, this is something we're really investing in, and they'll hire psychologists. And then other places where you don't really hear much. I mean, what's the status of diversion programs?
Yeah, so there is a lot of work being done currently to, in my view, improve the state of diversion, really level the playing field for diversion statewide. There's work being done by the Office of the Child Advocate through the Juvenile Justice Policy and Data Board. But if you really look at the landscape, have there been positive steps in diversion, particularly since 2018? Sure. You look in Suffolk County, for example, starting with DA Conley and really improving even more so under DA Rollins. We've seen that, diversion, and not just for low level, but sometimes for sort of mid-risk young people, is something that when it's really committed to is effective, and it keeps young people out of the system. But, in Massachusetts, to the extent that district attorney's offices, so there are different types of diversion, police diversion, district attorney diversion, and court diversion, which was enabled by the 2018 Criminal Justice Reform Act. You look at DA diversion as one of the primary mechanisms. There are 11 different district attorneys in Massachusetts, with 11 different ways of handling cases in general. So in and of itself, that, creates, different ways that things are handled. And then there's a resource issue. We have a lot more resources in Suffolk County than they have out in Berkshire County in Western Mass, which is much more rural, and transportation is an issue. So it's tougher for kids to get the services. So, one of the concerns with diversion is what we call justice by geography. No matter where you live in Massachusetts, it should not matter. If you have a certain type of offense and you're entitled to diversion, you should not only be able to have your case diverted, but you should be able to have the same level of services, whether you're in Roxbury or Wellesley or Pittsfield. It shouldn't matter. But we have a ways to go to hit that. Positive steps, as I mentioned, the OCA facilitated the development of a model youth diversion programming guide, which in my view creates a potential framework for standard practices that could be used across Massachusetts. And there's also a recent development where the Department of Youth Services and the Office of the Child Advocate, they've launched a state level youth diversion initiative to provide evidence-based programming to support diversion in 3 counties. So Middlesex County, Worcester County, and Essex County. So that's a pilot right now, but you can see there's at least some efforts to say, okay, we need to provide a greater support and framework for diversion. And my hope is that will expand so that we move away from justice by geography and we have a greater sense of equity in how it's utilized.
I think that it, in some ways, would be so ideal, because I think what's happening is that there's like this battle between how do we hold youth accountable for the things they've done, but then not be punitive and kind of end up putting them in a position that actually sets them up for failure. Well, how do you balance those two things?
Well, and to me, we have to move away from, for far too long in this country, the sole definition of accountability has been punishment. And you've seen it, for 40 years, we tried to punish people out of addiction, which was obviously going to fail, and we just kept doing it. As we sit in the midst of right now of a mental health crisis, in particular, a youth mental health crisis driven by just the isolation and anxiety and the trauma of the pandemic. You're hearing that same rhetoric of wanting to punish people. You cannot punish people out of their needs. You need to treat people's needs. Right. And there needs to be an understanding, a greater understanding that putting a person in a position to do the hard work of working on their needs and working on their issues, that is accountability. Putting someone in a box for 6 months and putting them out, just as bad off or worse off as they were before. I know that may appeal to some sense of retribution people want, but that's not helping anyone. It's not making your community safer. Taking someone and putting them in a position, particularly with diversion. I always say, if your approach leads to recidivism, no matter how much you think it's coming down hard, you're not making the community safer and you're not helping that person at all. But when you take someone and you help them deal with the issues that led them to act out, and then you're putting them in a position where they've been able to resolve some of those issues and they're less likely to get in trouble again, then they're not recidivating, then they're not coming back into the system, then they're not acting out in that way anymore. And then you've helped them and you've made your community safer.
So exactly what I think about is, what's the proof that the current approach is actually successfully keeping anybody safe?
We lead the world in mass incarceration. It doesn't. So my grandmother had a term when I was young, someone doing life 3 to 5 years at a time, where you punish the person over and over again and they come out over and over again, and the person doesn't get better because you've never dealt with those underlying issues that are driving their behavior. And I think it's one of those things, particularly in, there are people who call New England a land of steady habits. We get very used to doing things the way that we do them.
Yeah.
And there's this visceral reaction to change sometimes. But you have to look at parts of the system and say what we're doing clearly isn't working. And when something isn't working, you can't just double down on it because it's what you're familiar with. You have to have the courage to be willing to try something different, especially when you have data and you have those sample sizes which show that it works. Diversion works. It's not just giving a kid a free bite at the apple, which is what was derisively said about diversion in previous years. It's about saying that it's not that this young person is a problem. This young person has a problem. How do we get to the bottom of the problem? If this young person has a mental health concern and is untreated, how do we get them treatment? If this young person has gone through trauma, how do we get underneath that trauma and help them resolve that trauma? Because then you're building up stronger young men and women. You're helping them learn how to cope, to learn how to deal with their emotions. And you're just making it less likely that they end up getting into something down the road.
I like the idea of the kind of this young person is a problem versus this young person has a problem. And you're right. I think that slight distinction makes all the difference, because I think a lot of times our youth of color, they are seen as this person is a problem. And folks feel threatened by them. And so they were like, well, let's just kind of deal with them more harshly. Versus if they have a problem, okay, let's see what we can do to help them to change.
And race and poverty are real drivers of how, again, young people of every racial background and every socioeconomic status, have these sorts of issues that they're going through. It really falls on the adults and how we treat these young people and how we perceive them. That's why if we looked at all young people as they're having a problem, and the first question we have not is what are they doing, but why are they doing that? If you start your approach to young people with why, then you're able to really focus on helping young people be better, which is what we should all of us working in youth serving systems should be trying to do.
And so let's just talk about money for a little bit, because I'm sure that this is going to cost the state some money to process all these young adults and youth in general through the legal system.
Yeah.
What is the financial impact of diversion programs versus, because is it that diversion programs are more expensive and maybe that's why there's a hesitance to invest?
No, when you look at the long game, so much of our approach to juvenile and criminal justice is just based on the moment, the now. We're mad at this person did something wrong, and we want to just do this. We got to make them know that they did something wrong right now. Think of the long game. You invest in prevention. You invest in prevention, you invest in these supports, you invest in these services, even at the school level. You invest in extra counselors and school psychologists that can help redirect young people. You're going to help young people who are struggling get better. And when they get better, they become less likely to offend in the future. And when they become less likely to offend in the future, that's fewer kids flowing into your court system. That's fewer kids flowing into your DYS committed system. That's fewer kids moving into your criminal justice system, where we will save so much money because we literally invest support into redirecting the path of a significant number of young people. So, in my view, if we're really talking about, I don't just make my budget for my household to focus on what I'm gonna do this week. I make my budget, I project out for the year, I project out 5 years in my savings. I have to think long term. As a society, we have to start thinking long term and how we can take this current generation that are dealing with so many struggles. Do we want them to just blow up the deep end of our criminal justice system 10 or 15 years from now and explode mass incarceration? Or do we want them to be functioning adults who have jobs and are working and paying taxes and building up our tax base. Employers are saying, oh, we don't have enough people to work jobs. Well, you know what? Let's focus on keeping young people from becoming young adults who get into trouble and get records, which make it tougher, and put them in a position where they can be the people working those jobs and paying taxes. It lowers the amount that we're going to spend in the future, and it raises sort of your tax base by having young people in a better position.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that I think people sometimes take for granted is that adolescence and young adulthood is a time where people are forming their identity.
Yes.
And so what I see often is, kids that have been through the juvenile justice system, they form their identity around it. Well, I'm a bad kid. I'm a justice involved kid. That's who I am. And they'll often have a certain level of hopelessness, even kind of the sense that it doesn't matter. I'm going to get arrested again. So why bother try to not steal? Whereas the kids that I see that are going through, maybe they've been diverted to mental health services, they have charges, but they can show that they're, engaging in the mental health treatment and the charges will be dropped and that sort of thing. They're able to develop a different identity, an identity that, oh, you know what? I can change.
Yes.
I made a mistake but I still want to do this with my life. I still have things that I like to do, things that I'm good at. I can still go to school. I can still hang out with friends. And if I just do what I need to do, these charges won't follow me. So it's kind of this interest. It even kind of makes me think about the idea of what follows people and what doesn't.
Absolutely. Like, you're telling a young person. So a young person has made a mistake. They've done something wrong. Are you going to convey to that young person that they're worth investing in? That yes, you did something wrong, but we still care about you and we want to work with you? Or are you simply going to tell that person that no, we're going to drop a bunch of shame on you, we're going to call you a bad kid, and we're just going to punish you? And really, when you look at the reality of suspending a kid and excluding them from school, or arresting a kid and removing them from the community, you're telling a kid that they're a problem that needs to be taken away somewhere. That absolutely affects someone's identity. And we also have to, we have to continue to push, trauma-informed services for kids, because, one of the primary characteristics of young people who've been impacted by trauma is negative thinking. The kid who's been told, their loved ones, the people who are supposed to love them more than anyone, but they've told them, you're never going to amount to anything. You're just going to be like this person or that person. A lot of kids are coming in the door of schools or are walking around their communities already having internalized, those negative words and, those abusive type of statements. And so every time we punish a kid without even trying to help them, all we're doing is further affirming those negative things they've already heard about themselves. And that's how we end up with so many, as someone who spent many years practicing in, the juvenile and district courts, I would see kids they were so bright and they had so much potential, but just, their sense of self-esteem had been broken. And the fact that they tried to mask it with swagger or bravado didn't change the fact that you could see there was a deep pain inside, because they had never been treated, with care by anyone.
Yeah. It's very unfortunate. And I'll say even, I sometimes will see kids and they'll say, oh, well, let's see if you can help them with medication. And there's only so much medication can do if you have a system that's beating you down and telling you that you really don't have much to contribute to society.
It's so true. And I know you've seen it so much in ways, in the way that you've worked with, young people. But as a lawyer, it's interesting because sometimes it didn't even matter the result of the hearing or the trial or the case. Just getting in there and fighting for a kid and just letting a kid feel like, a kid who feels like everyone's just going to give up on them anyway, the mere act. And this is why I tell, regardless of what it is you do, if you step in and you just advocate for a kid, you're conveying to a kid that they're worth advocating for. And they may not have ever had anyone, or they may have had very few people who've ever done that before. Like telling kids their worth, conveying to kids that they're worth fighting for matters.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, the work that you do is so amazing, and sure, it's at kind of some personal sacrifice to you to be able to kind of do that level of advocacy, the time, and all of that. I was interested to know if there are any new initiatives or any updates on initiatives, from last year that have been going on.
Yeah, so I mean, we have a lot going on. We're in the midst of the 2022 legislative session right now.
Mhm.
And so we have, we have sort of three different buckets or three categories of legislation that we, in conjunction with the Massachusetts Juvenile Justice Coalition, which we convene, that we have made priorities. So those three sort of overarching areas are transparency and accountability, for the system, preventing juvenile justice system entry, which we've been talking about,
Yeah.
and then also stopping the harm of system involvement. So under transparency and accountability, we're advocating for a number of bills. We're advocating for a juvenile justice data bill that would mandate publicly available, the key here, cross-tabulated data. We need to have publicly available data that has outcomes at all those decision points by race, ethnicity, gender, age, and having that whereas anyone in the community can readily access those, so that because regardless of where you live in Massachusetts, you should be able to look at the courts and look at the system
Yeah.
and see how they're treating kids.
Yeah.
Preventing juvenile justice system entry, we have a package of school to prison pipeline bills, one of which would bar the suspension of young students between pre-kindergarten and the third grade, which is so important because, again, you look at racial disparities there. Black kids are more than 4.5 times as likely to be suspended from preschool to third grade. So again, it starts young. We have bills related to school policing. One would create a grant program. So for school districts who want to move away from police in schools, it would provide a grant program to really create alternative school safety plans that are infused with restorative practices and restorative schools and peer mediation and best practices. We have another that would state that yes, you can have a school resource officer program, but they're not to be stationed in schools. And then preventing the harm of system involvement, we have our Raise the Age bill, which would pull 18, 19, and 20-year-olds into the juvenile justice system. We have a bill that would mandate young people receive an attorney when they're being interrogated by law enforcement. There's so much data on the increased likelihood of false interrogations, and we've seen that play out even here in Massachusetts. And then also just excluding juvenile adjudications from being used to enhance adult sentences. If we acknowledge that young people are still developing, then why are we taking the mistakes committed by young people when they were still juveniles and using them to give harsher sentences as adults? So that's sort of just a quick overview. And then I'm happy to, if you go to www.cfjj.org and go to our Take Action page, you can find out how you can sign on to support any of these pieces of legislation.
Oh, you guys are doing so much in so many different kind of areas. I think it's just amazing. I mean, as you mentioned, this idea that the infractions that youth kind of find themselves in, they're then being used against them later on to kind of say, well, now you have this history, so now we can kind of include this history and give you a harsher sentence as an adult. I still find it so interesting that the courts don't really recognize developmental kind of stages or ages. I'm not. When will they?
The science has been there, and it's been so ready and so apparent for so long. Like there is nothing whatsoever magical about the age of 18.
No.
18 is just another stop on the way to having that frontal lobe, which controls our decision making and which, just our impulsivity and sort of our emotion relative to our logic. It's amazing that we make this determination that we treat people harsher when they aren't even fully developed for another 7 years at least. and it's tough. And when will they recognize it? I don't know. And again, I think we have this misunderstanding of what makes people better and what makes communities safer. This idea that you punish someone and they'll learn and not do it again. Well, we've got years of recidivism data that shows that that doesn't work. And I think when it doesn't work, people just say, oh, well, they were just bad people anyway, and they throw them away. In reality, if we focus more on treatment, if we focus more on diversion and keeping people out of the system, if we kept young people in the juvenile system longer, when at 18, you're not even out of high school most of the time. But if we kept these young people in the juvenile system and gave them more time to finish their education, develop some job skills, like think for a moment about what helps you get stable footing as an adult, not an adult who is causing problems, but what helps you reach a level of stability. It's finishing school. Getting a job, going from a job to a career, is gaining financial stability, and then having that financial stability when you start a family, so then you can lift your children into better circumstances. When we continuously lock young people up over and over again, we're taking those milestones that are necessary to gain a firm foothold in adulthood, and we're just pushing them down the road. You have young people who are in our house of correction right now, who still haven't finished high school, who haven't got an equivalency, who are handicapped at getting a job. And then we wonder at that point why people, once they've aged out of that behavior, once they've matured, once they hit the mid to late 20s, we've completely put an anchor around them to their life outcomes.
Because then now there's certain jobs they can't really ever get because if you do a background check, what pops up.
100%. And that's something that I think people don't realize. I think people in general understand, like, oh, if you have a record, it can make it hard. Like, there are 209 collateral consequences of a misdemeanor conviction in Massachusetts and 752 consequences of a felony conviction. And so, and it's important to mention that because and some of those are permanent mandatory. So not only does it keep you from getting certain jobs, it prevents you from getting certain licenses and being able to really enter, say someone who went through a lot of family strife, they get their life together, they go to college, they graduate, and they say, I want to be a family therapist. I want to help other families get the help that I never had. A record can prevent you from being able to get licensed for that, position. And so at some point in time, we have to think about these lifetime collateral consequences. There was a recent article in the Boston Globe about how the expungement that was in the 2018 law, as it is, it's virtually useless because virtually no one who needs it can utilize it. So while it's good that we do have expungement, you can expunge one case. Well, now you can expunge 2 cases, but no more than 2. In my view, once you have hit a point in your life where you are 3 years or 5 years removed from the last time you were in trouble and you have your life together, you should be able to expunge your prior record, especially your juvenile record. It makes no sense. It's not predictive of future offending. We've learned from studies that once you are 7 years removed from your last offense, you're no more likely to once you're 5 years removed from your last offense, you're no more likely to commit a crime than any other member of the general population. So why do we have 40-year-olds still having to answer a question about a conviction they were 19 on their record? It doesn't make it safer, but it makes people's lives harder. And we got to get off of this need to feel the need that we've just judged people enough and start thinking about what really makes our society better.
This feeling that we've done something about it.
Right. It's just like this constant need for retribution. It's like, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in what's going to make the people living in my community better, because when the people who are living in my community are better, that's going to make my community safer.
Well, I thank you so much for the work that you do. Thank you for, the work that you do with CfJJ. The fight is such an important one. The struggle is real. But we're seeing change year after year, little things changing. Instead, like raising the age a little bit, or more diversion programs, or kind of more advocacy. And little by little, for kind of achieving something.
And I do want to state that, it's easy to be so consumed by the work that still needs to be done that you can give short shrift to the work that has been done. It matters that our juvenile justice system is an eighth or a ninth of the size that it used to be. It matters that we were one of the first states to raise the lower age of juvenile court jurisdiction from 7 to 12, and that other states are now trying to follow our lead. One of the worst, what are we doing moments I ever had in court was I was a young lawyer. I was in Dorchester Juvenile Court, and an 8-year-old was in court at a table with an action figure and had no idea what was going on because the minimum age was 7 at that time. And, you look across the country and you have these judges that are punishing little kids. And I'm like, all common sense shows that isn't doing anything positive. And so by raising that lower age and directing families who need help to family resource centers where they can get help earlier, that's a huge step because we're getting kids the help so that once they hit 12, maybe they never do come into the system. So, we are doing things really well. We have accomplished reform, but it's always important to not rest on your laurels. Like I say, it's great when, we lower our dropout rate or we reduce the size of our system. But as long as there's inequity, as long as the benefits of that reform don't benefit all young people equally, we still got work to do.
Yeah. So guys, go to CfJJ.org website, click on the Take Action button and support. Whether you want to, I guess people can either support financially or they can join initiatives.
Absolutely. So you will see on the Take Action, you will see each of the pieces of legislation that I mentioned, as well as a few others. If you're a community-based organization, if you're a parent organizing group, and you say, absolutely, we need that, please reach out, email us, send in the form, and you can sign on to our testimony in support of those pieces of legislation, and we can keep you informed as we're lobbying for those bills up at the State House. And in general, look at our page as well. One thing that we've greatly increased that I did mention, we've increased our research at the municipal level. It is important to look at how are police officers, how are schools interacting with our young people, and is it equitably? So you'll see a number of research reports that we've done that really illuminate racial disparities that we believe can be tools for advocacy, not only at the State House, but at the local city council and school board level as well.
Guys, this is the fight for equitable kind of treatment of our young people. And we know that the justice system is one of the main areas where there's a great inequity. And so this is the work that you want to be involved with. So take action, check it out, see how you can join the fight. And thanks again, Leon, for being on the show today. I'll probably have you on again in a year for some more updates. So
anytime, it's my pleasure.
All right. And for those of you out there that have been listening or watching, thank you so much for joining today. If you have any questions, you can still drop them in the comment section. I'll be able to get them even after the show and answer any questions. So thanks again for joining and have a great week. Bye.